The first problem with this is that if the Christian God exists and you're saved through grace and you need to confess with your lips that Jesus is Lord and accept the free gift of salvation into your heart, then that's not a world in which ultimate justice exists either. So it's not like you believe in a world with ultimate justice. I sort of agree that if there's no God, then probably there's no ultimate justice. Unless you have like a very strictly works-based view of salvation, I don't see how you believe in ultimate justice either.
I wanted to call and thank you for the content you've put out. As a fellow non-believer who also has shaggy hair and a mustache and glasses, I feel like you've added a lot of legitimacy to my thoughts and wonderings about religion. So thank you for providing structure to the thoughts that are always rambling around in my head. I wonder if you have any thoughts on the idea of smart people who are religious. When I think about my reasons to believe or not believe in God, that's something that's very convincing to me. The idea that there's so many smart people out there who are theists. Does that argument do anything for you? I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you. So I think there's a legitimate question over the intellectual theistic tradition and intelligent believers, not just smart people who happen to be theists, but like smart theists. There are people who I greatly respect who are theists, and I used to say this thing where I'm like, yeah, they're intelligent except when it comes to theism, but I no longer think that. I think that it's rationally defensible to be a theist, even though I think the evidence is against it. But yeah, I mean, I think theism is wrong. And I think I can provide, compelling reasons to think that theism is wrong. But people disagree about all sorts of issues, and this is one of them. There are intelligent, well-informed theists who know a lot more about philosophy than I do, who have remained theists or become theists. So what do you do about the fact that there are epistemic authorities, not people who you're supposed to just mindlessly listen to, not an authority in that sense, but people whose opinion you should really care about, who think that you're wrong about things. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what to do about that general issue, other than just have a sense of humility about my own beliefs, try not to identify so much with my beliefs, so when people criticize them, I don't feel like I'm being criticized. That's pretty hard, but it's, I think, a necessary skill. Yeah, I think it just provides like a dose of humility. Like maybe you're missing something, maybe you don't know something that they know. And certainly everyone has something to teach someone else. So I think if you approach interactions and discussions in that mode of thinking, like, I want to understand this person and I'm sure that they have something to teach me, even if I think they're wrong about some big picture question, then I think that will lead to, a much more fruitful search for the truth than treating it like a Thunderdome match, which, I mean, that's why I hate a lot of, atheist YouTube channels and Christian YouTube channels as well, where they're like, let's get like a live stream where there are like 45 people and then we'll all scream at each other. Like that stuff is just unwatchable to me. Like this kind of like WWE style, like debate match. First of all, you've got to recognize that that's just entertainment. So if you recognize it as literally mindless entertainment, then sure. But if you think that's the way to try to figure out the way the world is, then you are sadly mistaken. That's an insane way to try to figure out the way the world is. So, I kind of like Josh Rasmussen's idea of like we're trying to figure out reality together. Like this is a cooperative project of just trying to figure out the way the world is. When you're in that mindset, I think it helps you find like-minded people, and it really turns you off to the people who aren't doing that on both sides. So look, I mean, I've said this a million times. I've heard it from Joe Schmidt in his Why I'm an Agnostic video, and I think it succinctly illustrates this crucial point in epistemology that we all occupy different positions on this grand epistemic landscape. We have different seemings, different intuitions, different bases of evidence. We've seen different videos, read different books, had different life experiences, met different people, and just we're coming at things with a different causal history and a different base of knowledge. So of course we don't come to the same conclusions. Does that mean that one of us is being irrational, or that you're intelligent except when it comes to theism? No, it just might mean that you have a different base of evidence and knowledge than I have. And given what you know, that's what makes the most sense. So, this isn't relativism. It's just pointing out the fact that we don't all have the same exact evidence, the same exact cognitive faculties, like the same exact life experiences. No two people occupy exactly the same position on the epistemic landscape, which means we can come to different conclusions and both be rational. There's no reason to, call each other stupid or say that we're in violation of some kind of epistemic norm or something like that. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting, this general problem of what do you do about people who you respect intellectually who come to these conclusions that clash with your own views? Well, I don't think you should just change your opinion based on what someone else says. I think you should try to reason your way to wherever you're going, and maybe they can help you see. I think that like rationality is often based on sight. Like you kind of just see something or you don't see it. So maybe they can help you see this thing that they see. But I think that you should generally stick to your guns and not really go somewhere yourself unless you can actually see it. You see things they don't see, they see things you don't see. I think that this should be a collaborative effort of trying to figure out the way the world is, and we should try to learn from each other, and we should not hold too tightly to the positions we have. I mean, I'm increasingly agnostic about everything. I feel like it's the only honest way to live. There are like 3 subjects where I feel like I'm like totally justified in like having a strong opinion about this. Sort of relatedly, there's this argument from the intellectual theistic tradition. I was going to defend that one in my devil's advocate debate, but as soon as I tried to start fleshing it out, it just didn't come together. It like I was convincing myself in the opposite direction as I was trying to flesh out this argument. So the basic thought is just, why isn't theism like flat Earth? Why are there so many luminaries who have been theists? What's the deal with the theistic intellectual tradition? Why is it as robust as it is? Why isn't it like flat Earth? If God is just a delusion, if God is like Santa Claus, then why isn't it something that doesn't persist? Belief in Santa Claus doesn't persist into adulthood. I mean, are you really prepared to say that atheists are the only intellectual adults in the room? Like, I'm not. But I think that there's just an exactly symmetrical argument from the intellectual atheist tradition, which is kind of an underdog in many respects. Like it was punished. Atheism was punished, and it still is punished, just not with violence in the way that it used to be. People sometimes downplay the violent enforcement of certain beliefs, in different times and places. It really was not an option to be an atheist and, an open out atheist. There's a reason that Hume wanted the dialogues published posthumously. So despite persecution, despite it being taboo, even when the persecution stopped, there was still this kind of social persecution. I remember hearing from Jeremy Behan, the host of Reasonable Doubts, that in the 90s, he used to say he was an atheist to open gasps in the room. So things have changed, even since then. Like, it's a lot more socially acceptable to be an atheist, even though it still is constantly mocked and ridiculed. Like, there still is this social pressure to not be an atheist, even if you don't really think Christianity is true. And yet, despite that, atheists have got, kind of a grip on the academy. Like, certainly, like in philosophy departments, it's kind of just expected that you're an atheist in many parts of the world, many developed, highly educated, wealthier parts of the world. That's just kind of the default assumption, that even if you're not an atheist, you're not like a fundamentalist or anything. So I think the intellectual history of atheism is way more impressive. Like if you can make an argument from the theistic tradition, the intellectual theistic tradition, well, then you can make an exactly symmetrical argument. At worst, at least it's a symmetrical argument, but really I think it's sort of more powerful, because why isn't atheism like flat Earth? I mean, if God exists, like, why isn't this just some kind of fringe view that's accepted by a couple of nut jobs like flat Earth? Like, why does it have the prestige that it has, despite terrible persecution, in history, and today just kind of a more like a more indirect, softer form of, I don't want to exaggerate, or persecution or whatever, but I mean, in many quarters, it is seriously disadvantageous to be an atheist. Let's put it that way. So, despite having so many things go against it, it has still managed to not only get a foothold, but, continually gain ground. It's just kind of the underdog, and yet somehow it has the intellectual pedigree that it has. So, I think the intellectual atheist tradition has a lot going for it, and it's overcome more obstacles than the theistic tradition. It has the intellectual history it has despite suppression.
Hey Emerson, it's me, John Buck again. I had another interesting thing I sort of wanted to run by you. I know you're probably like no big fan at all of like moral arguments for God's existence, but there's a couple moral arguments that I've heard that are different from most of the others. Like you'll have a sort of like Craig's argument for God's existence, like from the moral ontology of the world to God, and then you'll have something like Desmond Kremit's argument from moral knowledge, which is sort of like an epistemological sort of argument for God's existence. But there's two others, or like they're kind of the same that I at least find interesting. I don't know if they really should give like the atheist any like epistemic reasons to think that God does exist, but I do find them interesting and something to sort of like ponder. So the first one is what I take to be like Kant's sort of moral argument for God's existence. I haven't actually read it like firsthand because like who is going to read Kant? But from the way that I've heard it described and read about it, it sounds kind of interesting. It's basically something like you always have a moral duty to act in accordance with all of your moral obligations, or something like that. So that's like a pretty obvious premise, it seems like. And then there's the sort of recognition that if you were completely like disheartened as to the ultimate justice in the world, that would diminish your ability to act as a perfectly moral and just agent. And so, okay, so that's another sort of thing where basically a sort of recognition that no, there is no just desserts for anyone and how they behave and things like that. And so we ultimately have no reason to, well, at least if you're someone who might be disheartened by the fact that like Hitler basically got away with it in the end or something like that. I don't know. You can take it maybe like for you as somebody like Elon Musk, the fact that some rich bastards can basically own everything and then like live a really cushy life and then maybe live a
I like how he's like, well, there's Hitler, or for you, like Elon Musk.
all the way up to 80, and then they're basically never having to pay for their deeds in any sort of way. Like that might dishearten you to the extent that it may make you not be as motivated to do what you know to be right or wrong. So anyway, and then like the third premise, I guess, would be something like, in order to believe that there is ultimate justice in the end, you would have to believe that God exists or something very much like God. I think he makes a sort of stronger case than maybe is really necessary. Like you could maybe say that if there's some sort of like Buddhistic karma, this could also play a similar role. J.L. Schellenberg, I think his like notion of ultimism sort of is derived from Kant's sort of reasoning here. So, and then basically there's the sort of apply the moral obligation to our beliefs where, okay, since we would be ultimately morally disheartened if we were to believe that there was no ultimate justice in the world, and the only way that we can believe that there's no ultimate justice in the world is if we think that God exists. Therefore, we have like a moral obligation to believe that God exists. And now, I'm sure probably you might think that this is just not even true because like doxastic voluntarism is false. But I'm thinking that maybe like there's a way in which you could work around that, either in saying that like you're not really believing, but maybe you're acting as if, and that's something that's under our voluntary control. And maybe that's in a sense how it's more in line with like our moral duties. Another way that you can maybe think about it is that like, well, yeah, even if doxastic involuntarism is true, then this is the sort of argument that should give you like moral reason to believe in God, even if it doesn't give you epistemic reason to think that God exists. Anyway, it's a kind of interesting argument. I'm curious of your thoughts. And okay, and then there's this argument sort of similar to that, which is basically like a practical argument. Like maybe you think that's too strong to say that you have a moral obligation to believe that something like God exists. But there's, I don't know, I kind of see a similarity in our mutual friend Nathan Digital Gnosis, how his sort of like draw towards Christianity is due to the effects that he observes in himself and his moral character, where when he tries to imagine or identify with this sort of Christian vision of the world, he finds himself acting more morally. Now, I know that you had said before that, like, if you had to go to church, you would just become an anti-theist. Fair enough. Maybe it's not for everyone. But I think for at least some people, they might see that, like, there is this, like, positive benefit that they get from trying to see the world through a Christian lens. And if they have a desire to, like, be the best type of person that they can be, this might give them a sort of practical reason to explore Christianity further, or maybe explore some sort of like perfect being theism further, just because they see how they can like express God's love through their actions. Whereas if they thought that everything was ultimately mindless at the foundation of the world, they might not have this sort of like motivation behind it. Anyway, these are just two ideas I wanted to hear your thoughts on. I find them like interesting moral arguments for God. Bye.
So that was number one caller, John Buck, who just received his 2 voicemail challenge coin. So if any of you want to compete for number one caller, then you've got your work cut out for you already. Yeah, I'm still laughing about, well, you know, a lot of people think that Hitler's really bad, and maybe you don't quite understand that. Maybe someone like Elon Musk would make it click for you more. No, he was alluding to my socialist tendencies, where, yeah, there are these people who, you know, exploit workers, and they, you know, hoard all of this wealth to the great expense of so many people who die preventable deaths or live lives of a lower quality than is necessary. And yeah, they just get to sort of get away with it. And I'm also anti-Hitler, in case anyone's wondering. But yeah, I mean, there are a few interesting moving parts there. So first off, I sort of agree that if there's no God, then probably there's no ultimate justice. Yeah, maybe there's something like karma. And yeah, that would ensure ultimate justice. Maybe something, yeah, like you alluded to, Schellenberg. So yeah, there are potentially other ways to ensure ultimate justice. Karma seems like the one that makes the most sense in a straightforward way. But probably, if there's no God, there is no ultimate justice. So there are a few problems with this. The first problem with this is that if the Christian God exists, and you're saved through grace, and you need to confess with your lips that Jesus is Lord and accept the free gift of salvation into your heart, then that's not a world in which ultimate justice exists either. So it's not like you believe in a world with ultimate justice. To any Christians who are listening to this who have that sort of like faith-based view, unless you have like a very strictly works-based view of salvation, I don't see how you believe in ultimate justice either, because the son of Sam is a sincere Christian, I think, at this point, you know, a serial murderer. After he got caught, he got really big on forgiveness all of a sudden. No, I don't know anything about that guy. I'm just saying that there are lots of people who convert and have, I think, sincere conversions after they've done horrible things in their lives. Someone who has a serious conversion and then, you know, was killed in prison, that person did pretty much get away with it, you know? Like, they did whatever they wanted to. They had a sincere conversion experience, and then they're, you know, like a few months into their prison sentence, they're killed. So how did that person not just get away with it? You know, the thing about grace and salvation and that is it does make life sort of not fair and unjust, but apparently that's how God wanted it to be. I mean, it seems like there's this tension between his merciful nature and his just nature. And I don't know exactly the give and take between those two things, but you can't be like perfectly just and perfectly moral in the sense that you never fail to be just and you never fail to be merciful. I think I said moral a second ago. Now, maybe you've struck the perfect balance between these two things, but still, that doesn't mean that, you know, they're not in tension. And the other thing that I would mention is I sort of have the exact opposite intuition when it comes to ultimate justice and feeling inspired to do. I mean, I'm not even quite sure I understand that premise of the argument that, like, if there's no ultimate justice, then why bother having any at all? That doesn't quite make sense to me. Like, I don't see how thinking that there's ultimate justice inspires moral action on our part here on Earth. in our finite lives. And I don't see how believing that there's not going to be ultimate justice just sort of depletes any motivation to carry out any justice. Why would that sap your motivation to do anything, to find out that someone else is not going to take care of it, and that the only justice we have is the justice that we make, and that makes you feel like, why bother at all? So I too have not read Kant because, as you said, who the is going to do that? But I actually tried one time and it was unbearable. I'm only hearing about this from you for the first time, so I don't know if there's like something missing or whatever. But as it stands, it seems like literally the opposite is true. If you think that someone else is gonna take care of it, then why would you do anything? Like, my experience is that belief in a perfect being who's ensuring justice brings about this complacency where you think, why bother doing anything because God's taking care of it. Being an atheist in some ways is kind of exhausting because there's not this like safety net, so it's totally conceivable, like you alluded to, that the bad guys could win and the good guys could lose, and then that would be it. That's a possibility in a world where God doesn't exist and where there's no karma and so on. But in a world where God exists, then ultimate justice is going to be enacted. So, I mean, here's like a thought experiment, and I don't think I'm unique. I don't have some kind of weird psychological features that make this the case for me. I think there might be kind of other factors that are bound up here that are causing some people to have the intuition that, well, if God didn't exist, then why bother trying to carry out any sort of justice? Like, if people do feel that way, then I don't think it's for this reason because it doesn't make any sense. Like, um, imagine if you had a lot to do, you had a lot on your plate, and you felt like there was no way you could possibly accomplish it all. And I said, hey, I can do this one thing on your list. Like, let me just take care of it so you have less to worry about. You are just not going to do anything about that because I'm taking care of it. And you would feel relieved because there wouldn't be any more responsibility on your part to take care of this thing. So, how is that not the case with ultimate justice, where it seems like someone got away with something, but you can just be relieved? You can sit back because someone else is taking care of it. You don't have to do anything. Someone else is taking care of it. So I almost feel the opposite way. Like, God sort of lures people into complacency about all the evil of the world, where they're sort of feeling like, well, this must be just, this must be good, there must be some rationale behind what I'm seeing, or else a perfectly good God wouldn't have permitted this, distribution of suffering that we see in the world. And I think it's sort of similar with the case of justice, where if it seems like something is unjust, then maybe it is unjust, but rest assured, God is going to ensure that there's ultimate justice. Except, he's not actually, because we're saved by grace, and we don't achieve salvation through works, according to most Christians that I know. But that aside, once there's someone else in the mix who's taken care of it, then why would you feel any motivation to do anything about it? It's like, I took the thing off your to-do list and you still feel like you have to do it. That's irrational. Someone else is taking care of it. So yeah, I mean, if this is what Kant argued, then it's a bad argument. I mean, I just have the exact opposite intuition here. And if I probe it further, then it's like, yeah, that makes sense. If no one's going to take care of it except for humanity, humanity has to take care of it. But if there's this other being, this supernatural being that's going to take care of it, then I can just kind of, kick back, I can become complacent. Just to finish a thought I brought up briefly a moment ago, I've said elsewhere, I think like when I spoke to the non-alchemist on my channel, I mentioned how being an atheist is kind of exhausting in a certain sense, because suddenly it feels like the burden is on you and the rest of humanity to ensure that justice wins, that, to put it in very crude terms, that the good guys win and the bad guys lose, because it's a real possibility that the opposite could happen. In a naturalistic world, it's totally possible that goodness loses, evil wins, and humanity dies, and that's the end of the story. This is it, like, if there's no justice in this life, then there's no justice. But you did mention this sort of doxastic voluntarism point about like, well, even if this argument worked, maybe you can't choose what you believe, which I think is obviously right. You can't choose what to believe, but you can sort of choose your actions, and maybe you should act as if God exists. Like, again, if this argument works, which it doesn't on any level, but just going along with it, you can't choose what you believe, so it's not like you have an obligation to believe in God. You can't be obligated to do things that you can't do. Ought implies can. So if you can't choose your beliefs, then you're not obligated to believe one thing instead of another thing. But you can control your actions. So maybe you're obligated to act as if theism is true, or you're obligated to, you have some kind of duty to not spread atheism because you think it's harmful or something like that. So I agree with the sort of generic premise that you have an obligation to not spread harmful beliefs, but I just don't think atheism is a harmful belief. I don't think it undermines justice or goodness or anything like that. I think the goodness is in the world, the purpose is in the world. It's not granted to us by a deity. Okay, next caller.
Hey, I wanted to ask if necessary beings exist, meaning things that must necessarily exist, or including abstract concepts. It never made any sense to me as an argument for God back when I was a theist, and now that I'm an atheist, it makes even less sense that there are things that have to exist. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you for that. So there are a few different questions there. You mentioned that this doesn't make any sense to you as an argument for God, and I agree with you that this doesn't make any sense as an argument for God. So I made an episode called Why I Don't Spend More Time on Contingency Arguments or something like that. So if you want to hear why I don't think this is a good argument for God, then you can listen to that. And it doesn't involve sort of denying contingency arguments or saying that, oh, they don't work. Here are the faulty premises. It's like, no, it's like there could be a metaphysical necessity at the foundation of reality. And that wouldn't really prove theism. I almost suspect that it doesn't even favor theism, but that's connected to sort of a deeper thing. I don't really know how to talk about it. It's just there's certain things that seem connotated with theism and with atheism, but there doesn't seem to be any real logical connection between them, like libertarian free will, non-physicalism, moral realism. There are certain ideas that are associated with theism in people's minds, and then they think, oh, atheists, you have to reject objective morals, you have to reject moral realism, you have to believe that determinism is true, that we don't have free will, that physicalism is true, that it's just a matter of physical brain processes, that's what consciousness is. There's nothing over and above the purely quantitative description offered by physical science. That's it. So that's wrong. People who are philosophically inclined, in my experience, rarely try to argue that atheists have to be moral anti-realists or they have to be moral nihilists. There's no way for you to get away from it. Like, that's sort of like a pop apologist, like Frank Turek level thing. And I think that there are reasons that people feel that way that don't have much to do with the actual logical connections here. Like, there's no entailment or implication of atheism that should really strongly favor moral anti-realism. And I think the same is true with a long list of other subjects that are kind of connotated with atheism or connotated with theism. So I think that necessary being, the idea that there could be a necessary being, that's sort of associated with theism. And I think that Graham Oppy has done a really good job of kind of really making it click for people how this just doesn't really favor one over the other. Like the idea of a metaphysical necessity is not really a great argument for God, because naturalists can believe in a metaphysical necessity, and it doesn't really seem clear how it could favor one over the other. So I think that's true with more things than just a necessary being, but all this to say, I agree with you that it's not a good argument for God. So it would be better just to listen to the episode to get sort of the full picture here, but let me just read what Graham Oppy wrote about this. Whatever range of options is open to the theist to explain the existence of God, exactly the same range of options is open to the naturalist to explain the existence of the universe. If it's open to the theist to say that God exists of necessity, then it's open to the naturalist to say that the universe exists of necessity. If it's open to the theist to say that God's existence involves an infinite regress, then it's open to the naturalist to say that the existence of the universe involves an infinite regress. If it's open to the theist to say that the existence of God has no explanation, then it's open to the naturalist to say that the existence of the universe has no explanation. Insofar as we're interested in explaining the existence of the universe, why is there something rather than nothing or something along those lines, the postulation of a God who creates the universe does not bring with it any explanatory advantage. So that was from an argument for atheism from naturalism, which is like a very introductory article that he wrote. You can find a PDF of it online. I linked it in the show notes of this episode. Why don't I spend more time on contingency arguments? And this is from The Best Argument Against God. Given that naturalists and theists have exactly the same options when it comes to explaining why there is causal stuff rather than complete absence of causal stuff, each can hold that it is necessary that there's causal stuff, and each can hold that it's a brute fact that there's causal stuff. Considerations about global causal structure do not count in favor of one view rather than another. The conclusion that we've reached here may be surprising to some readers. After all, cosmological arguments are widely recognized to be among the strongest standard arguments for the existence of God, and yet cosmological arguments typically appeal to considerations about global causal structure. So does that answer the question, your first question, is there a necessary being? No. The only point is that if we're in the context of arguing about atheism versus theism, then the idea that this really is going to, adjudicate the matter, like, okay, well, first we got to figure out whether there's a necessary being, and then we'll know whether or not God exists. That is completely wrong. And I think that's also the case with, physicalism, with libertarian free will, with moral realism, and philosophers to different degrees have recognized that kind of point. They recognize that, moral realism is not really like a problem for atheists. Like atheists can be, for instance, non-naturalists. And Appy's point is like a little more contentious, I think, but it's still pretty widely recognized, I think. So we're still not there when it comes to physicalism versus non-physicalism, or like free will versus non-free will, or actually we are there with free will, because most philosophers are compatibilists and most philosophers are atheists. So actually most philosophers do recognize that you can have free will and no God. So these things are socially, kind of associated, but that's all it is. So is this not that great of an argument for God? Yeah, I agree. I don't think it really makes sense as an argument for God. The first question was, is there a necessary being? I'm kind of agnostic about there being a necessary being. It makes sense to me, a few days a week. I would recommend Josh Rasmussen's work. He's done a lot of interviews on YouTube with Crusade Against Ignorance and Majesty of Reason. And he's a great person to explain this to you and kind of make it intuitive, where you start with these sort of explanatory principles that are certainly more plausible than not. But, as he'll tell you, you always have to divide between stage 1 and stage 2 arguments. Stage 1 is just establishing a necessary being. Stage 2 is when you start adding all these other divine attributes. And that's when it gets pretty tricky. Bottom line is, you can accept, as a naturalist, as an atheist, you can say, that contingency argument, it actually works. I think there is a metaphysical necessity. I think there's a necessary being at the foundation of reality. And I'm an atheist. I mean, this is not a hot take on my part. This is widely recognized. But as for your question about just what is necessity to begin with, I think you said, I don't even know what this is supposed to be. Like, the concept doesn't make any sense to me. Okay, so arguing about theism and atheism aside, in straightforward terms, if something is necessary, then it couldn't have been otherwise. So you imagine the entire span of possible worlds, all the ways in which things could have been, and there are certain commonalities across all these possible worlds. They have all kinds of differences. Like in some of these possible worlds, I exist, and other ones I don't exist. In some possible worlds, there's a species of hyper-intelligent reptiles that's having the same exact conversation that we're having right now. These are all things that, are conceivable. So we can divide between logical necessity and metaphysical necessity. Metaphysical necessity is pretty contentious. I mean, everything is contentious in philosophy, but logical necessity seems a lot easier to get a grip on. If it couldn't have been otherwise in sort of logical terms, then that seems to be pretty easy, right? I think it's necessarily true that if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. I think that's necessarily true across all possible worlds. That is the case. There's no possible world in which that's false. I mean, my conception of logical possibility is just that if it doesn't entail a contradiction, then it's logically possible. So logically contradictory things can't be true, and things that logically have to be true those are logically necessary. There are other things that are necessarily false. So I think something is logically impossible if it's contradictory. I think something is logically necessary if its negation is contradictory. It can't be true that Santa Claus exists and Santa Claus does not exist. That's necessarily false because it's contradictory. The proposition Santa Claus exists and he does not exist. So some things are logically impossible, and I think those are necessarily false. There are other things that are sort of non-negotiable, and they couldn't have been false. They're necessarily true. Across all possible worlds, there's no world in which, so take the internal angles of a two-dimensional triangle. The internal angles of a two-dimensional triangle add up to 180 degrees every time. There's no possible world in which the internal angles of a triangle add up to 761.89 degrees. That doesn't exist. There's no such possible world. It's necessarily false that there's a two-dimensional triangle whose internal angles add up to whatever number I just said, 700 something. So there are some things that are necessarily true, other things that are necessarily false. And this is just it doesn't seem that crazy to me. So there, you've got some things that are necessary already. Now, metaphysical necessity is more complicated, way more contentious. What goes into metaphysical necessity is, a matter of debate. So I think something is logically impossible if it's contradictory. I think something is logically necessary if its negation is contradictory. And when it comes to metaphysical necessity, I don't really know. So like Richard Swinburne's conception of it is something like, if you substitute uninformative rigid designators with informative rigid designators when you're talking about logical possibility and necessity. So you take just, the kind of logical possibility and logical necessity that we've been talking about, and then you substitute, I think, uninformative rigid designators with informative rigid designators, and that's what metaphysical possibility is. So if that sounds fun to you, then you can look more into that. But I feel like I have, a grip on just the standard notion of necessity, which is just that it couldn't have been otherwise. I mean, if it exists across all possible worlds, then it's necessary. I don't think it entails any kind of metaphysical, spookiness to think that some propositions are necessarily true, other propositions are necessarily false. And from there, it's kind of a short step to thinking some beings are necessarily existent and other beings are necessarily non-existent.